Hey there, this is David Lyon, founder of Evolving Man. And in this video, I want to discuss my key insights and a summary of Robert Augustus' master's book, Emotional Intimacy. So let's dive into the first point, which are some of the most common misconceptions that we have about emotions. The first one being, emotion, according to masters, is a verb, not a noun. So that means that our emotions are never set in stone. They are in constant motion, they're constantly changing, and actually by turning towards them, we will notice two things very strongly. One being we can heavily affect our emotional experience, and two, if we were to stop resisting our emotions constantly, then we would see that they're actually changing very quickly. To go further with that, we need to look at the difference between feeling and emotion, which gets confused a lot. So Master says that feeling is simply the registering of sensation in your body. So when you notice that your belly contracts, or your heart is beating fast, or you're sweating, or you're contracting, you're lifting up your shoulders, or your jaw is tense, that in and of itself is not yet an emotion. An emotion is basically how we respond to our feelings. Basically, what is it that we do with our feelings? And so Master says that there is basically a complex interplay happening between the feeling, so between something that we're registering in our body, our cognition, so what we're thinking about what we're feeling, then certain social factors like what's the social context in which this is happening, and then our learned behaviors. So all of our history basically affecting how we learned to respond to our feelings, for example, as children. And so basically what we start seeing is that we cannot really affect feeling because that happens so fast that we cannot avoid whatever it is that we're experiencing in our bodies. But by becoming more emotionally literate, so understanding, well, what's the experience that is actually going on, and by noticing all these different factors, we become really empowered to start affecting our emotional experience. Second misunderstanding that we tend to have about our emotions is that we think that human beings can be either rational or emotional. And so basically when anyone turns towards their emotions, we kind of see it as becoming less rational or irrational, which is kind of the opposite of what Masters argues. He says unrepressed emotions, so when we actually allow ourselves to give our emotions the space that they need, it actually improves our mental and social skills. And that which weakens our mental skills is when we either repress our emotions, so we hold them back, which of course creates a lot of tension and contraction, or we overindulge in our emotions, which is not what emotional intimacy is about. So this whole book is basically about learning how to relate to our emotions so that we're not acting from them, so that we're not blinded from the sudden rush of energy that is happening, but we can relate to them in a very healthy, vulnerable, and supportive way. And so when we learn to do that, the emotional experience and our ability to rationally look at something, they don't necessarily interfere with each other. So we can both fully embrace our subjective experience of something makes me sad because of these and these factors, and at the same time I can look at the situation from an objective point of view. So again, seeing the difference between overindulging in my emotions or repressing them versus learning to be emotionally intimate with myself. Last misconception that I want to go to about emotions is this idea that there are negative and positive emotions. And Master says no emotion in and of itself is negative, but what we do, how we respond to our emotions can be negative. And so he discerns between adaptive responses and maladaptive responses. And so one key point that he points out is every emotion can coexist with compassion. And so when I'm able to be angry and compassionate at the same time, chances are high that I will use this energy in actually a supportive way. Now, usually when we talk about negative emotions, it's already something that we're doing with that emotion. So either we're avoiding to feel it, and so doing all sorts of crazy things like putting another emotion on top. We'll go into that in a second, or getting lost in our minds. Like, for example, he talks about fear leading to us worrying. And so worrying is what we do with fear. because when we worry, we feel fear, and then our response is that we go into our mind and we indulge in the thoughts, which is basically a way to avoid simply feeling the fear. And so the more that we can start seeing that there are simply adaptive and maladaptive responses to our emotions, we can see that emotions in and of themselves are not negative. They're also not really positive. They're simply energies that are flowing through us anyway. And so our challenge is, can we find the adaptive response? Can we find healthy ways to use these emotions to empower us to take action in our lives, to connect to our loved ones vulnerably, and to, for example, sharpen our moral compass, as it is with shame, which we'll go into in a second. So now I want to go into some of the most common negative emotions that we have and take a look at how Masters looks at them. And afterwards, we're going to go into how to actually develop emotional intimacy, first with yourself and then in relationship. So let's start with fear. Master says fear is basically excitement and drag. And if you are looking for any kind of emotion to connect you to your passion for life and feeling more energized, then he says look no further than fear. Because within our fear, our excitement is basically caged. And he gives this metaphor of looking at fear like a tight fist, right? And so when we think about negative fear, like we don't like our fear, it's basically contracted fear. It's when we experience fear, we feel fear, and our bodies contract so it doesn't get the space that it needs to unfold the way it would like to, like a closed fist. And he says if we learn to open our fist wide open, then what fear will turn into is excitement and passion for life. Now, of course, this is easier said than done, but it's really important, I find, to understand that when we don't like our experience of fear, it's usually not the fear itself, but how we respond to it. So next emotion that we are going to look at is shame. So according to Masters, shame is the most hidden emotion, and that we're so pervaded by shame, both individually and collectively, that we feel shame about how much shame we have. And in my experience, especially men have deep layers of shame and then layers of other emotions on top of that to avoid feeling their shame. And so we'll go into that in a second. But basically, shame is the experience of being defective, wrong, or bad. And so what it leads to kind of physically is usually that our head starts hanging more, our back gets rounded, and our face contracts and we feel a kind of heat. And I know that there are people who would argue that shame in and of itself is always toxic and that we should try to feel as little shame as possible or get rid of it. Now, Master says that there's a difference between healthy and toxic shame, and that when worked with wisely, shame can actually lead to developing a kind of healthy moral compass. And so one of the differences that he describes is healthy shame is always directed at a certain behavior, whereas toxic shame is directed at the person doing it. So there's a big difference between saying I did something wrong and I feel shame about it, or I feel ashamed because I'm a shitty human being. And so most of the shame that we experience, in my perspective, is the toxic kind of shame where we believe I am wrong and bad. Now, there are a lot of things that we do to avoid feeling shame, and especially this kind of deflating effect that I just described also physically, and one of them being pride. So, because pride has the kind of opposite direction of inflating us. And so this is a common compensation route that men use to avoid feeling their shame. Now the problem is, once your pride fades out, underneath you will still experience shame. So it doesn't really transform it in any way. Now, Masters also says that yes, temporarily, shame brings us to our knees. So it is not a pleasant experience, and in that I think it's also different from other emotions. But again, when we meet our shame with compassion, it can basically develop into a sort of healthy conscience, into a moral compass of how do I want to show up in the world, and of being aware of the consequences of my actions. So next we will dive into anger. And as with the other emotions, Master says most of what we think is anger is actually anger avoidance. So for him, anger is connecting to this fire, this kind of fiery passion that comes up of feeling something is wrong, but staying connected to the hurt and the vulnerability that are part of it. And so one example of anger avoidance is aggression. And he says aggression is when we connect to this fiery power, but we completely disconnect from our compassion, from our vulnerability and the hurt. Now, another example of anger avoidance, which I'm definitely guilty of, is using sarcasm. And I notice that when I use sarcasm, I'm not connected in many situations to my warmth, to my heart. So there's a kind of coldness to that anger that is underneath the sarcasm. And then one important piece that Master points out is the difference between clean anger and unclean anger. And so whereas unclean anger blames a lot and shames, clean anger stays connected to care, stays connected to vulnerability, and clean anger is more focused on the energy of anger rather than the content. Because when we start getting into the content, it's very easy to get lost. Whereas when we're more connected to the energy, like how does it feel in my body, we are staying a lot more vulnerable and open also to the transformation of this experience. And lastly, to master our anger, one really important piece is remaining aware of how our anger is affecting the people around us. So are they still able to be present with us, or is this experience so overwhelming for them that they're actually shut down and emotionally completely disconnected? Then that does not support any kind of emotional intimacy. But we'll go into that in a second a bit further. So next up in our list of unpleasant emotions, we have sadness. And so Masters describe sadness as loss taken to heart. So when there's something precious that leaves our lives and we remain open to how this actually affects us. Now, sadness is something that culturally men are not supposed to feel. And Master says that once men's shame has been addressed, they usually start crying. So basically the sadness is being hidden under layers of shame. And then he also talks about how it's so common for men to have these thick walls of anger and shame around them that we almost believe that that's what it means to be a man. And one other important piece about sadness is to understand the difference between sadness and depression. And Masters basically says, if the two were colors, then sadness would be blue and depression would be black. When you're connected to sadness, there is motion and you're being uncovered, whereas in depression, there's no motion, there's basically no movement, and the blankets are staying up, so you're basically staying hidden. There's no vulnerability really in depression. And lastly, about sadness, a good reminder, he says the most painful part of crying is just before its onset. So finally, after all these terrible negative emotions, we've arrived at joy. And this is not a surprise that I'm going into joy after looking at all these others, because according to Masters, joy is more of a foundation than something that we can reach. And he says, if you want to feel more joy, turn towards your pain. Turn towards all the experiences that you don't want to have, and that will lead you to experience more joy. Now, there's a beautiful kind of differentiation that Master uses for different kinds of joy. He says what most of us kind of try to achieve is situational joy, which is the joy that you might experience when winning the lottery, or getting a beautiful birthday gift, or making a lot of money, or having good sex, whatever it is. And then he says there is something else, which is non-situational joy, which is realizing that, again, joy is more a foundation of life than something that you achieve. And this is simply the joy of being. And then there's a last kind of way of joy that he describes, which is realizational joy. And that is when you've achieved something very meaningful in your life, something that you might have been working hard towards, something that you've accomplished, something that's really important for you, then that's kind of a different joy than the situational joy. because it's not inflated by your ego. It's not this kind of, oh my God, I'm so great. It's just this deep sense of meaning that you get when you work towards something for a long time and then you finally arrive. So let's now look at how you can become more emotionally intimate with yourself and with other people. So for that, let's start with, what is emotional intimacy? Well, to put it very simply, it's knowing what you're feeling and being able to name it, which we would call emotional literacy. And then the other piece being the ability to relate to your emotional experience instead of acting from it. So we're not repressing it, we're not creating this huge distance, this cold distance, we're being compassionate with our own experience, but we're also not fused with it. So we're not just speaking from the emotion, right? That would be overindulging in a way. Now, another piece that I found really helpful that Masters named is being able to name, both for ourselves and others, when we're emotionally disconnected. So there's nothing wrong for not always knowing what you're feeling. But what it takes is that step of vulnerability to be like, I don't know what I'm feeling right now, right? Oh, I'm emotionally disconnected. I don't know exactly what is going inside of me right now. Then Masters also talks about the importance of both containment and expression. And so containment is the ability to stay with your own experience, not push it away, but also not kind of burst it out and not like throw it at the other person. That is containment. On the other side, we have expression, which is the ability to really embody whatever emotion that we're going through. If you're angry, you stand there and you communicate, I'm angry right now, instead of being like, I'm feeling some anger right now, right? So you're actually, you're being authentic in that moment. So both of these skills are necessary, according to Masters, to develop emotional intimacy. And one way that he talks about developing especially this ability to express your emotions, because for most of us that can be pretty hard. And he says practicing conscious rants is one way to do that. And so I'm going to link the document summary of this book, of the summary that I created, in the comment section, so you can check out this practice of the conscious rant. And then one other piece for becoming more emotionally intimate is acknowledging that being emotional is not something feminine or female, and being rational is not masculine or male, that we're all emotional beings, and that does not in any way weaken our rationale, as I said in the beginning. Now, let's lastly look at how we can develop more emotional intimacy in relationships, which is something that I know many of us are longing for. So one of the most effective ways that Master says we can do that is to start naming and sharing some of the experiences that we would most want to hide. Now that needs a certain context, so it's helpful that when you're with your partner, that for example you say, hey, I would like to create a space where both of us have the opportunity to share and the other person just listens. So it's not an everyday conversation. And two things he says are very powerful to go into are sharing what you're afraid to share and sharing what you're ashamed about yourself. And basically the practice of this is creating a container together with your partner where you become curious about your fears and about what you're ashamed about, so that your relationship is actually a supportive container of growth instead of this place where you have to perform any kind of particular way of being. So this is my summary of Emotional Intimacy by Robert Augustus Masters. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like. Check out the document summary that I created. There's a lot more information out there, like the practice and much more. And if you're interested in more of these summaries, then check out the Evolving Man Embodiment's Hub, where I post one book summary like this per month and lots of valuable resources around all these juicy topics. So I hope I'll see you in there. Much love and talk to you soon.